Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Vegas Golden Knights and lost by a score of 2-1. And just as I said a few days ago, and as I will continue to say for the rest of this preseason, the results and the scores of these games don't really matter. There have been teams in the past who have gone 6-0 through the preseason and then finished dead last in the actual standings, and there are other teams that have gotten demolished to the preseason just to go on to then win the Stanley Cup that very year. And so victories or defeats, not the end of the world. Having said that, however, 5 days ago, the Sharks played against the Vegas Golden Knights, and the Golden Knights brought out what could only really be described as an AHL caliber lineup. There are rules in the preseason that you do need to have a certain amount of NHL veterans, but that is a very kind of vague description of a player. There are NHL veterans who are like Jack Eichel and Tomas Hertl, and then there are others like the ones who played tonight, like Ben Hutton, who are more so these kind of like between NHL and AHL type of guys, but do fit the kind of description of this particular rule. And so once again here tonight, 5 days later, while I thought the Golden Knights would bring a somewhat more competitive roster here, because they played yesterday, and that is where we saw guys like Eichel and Marner and Shea Theodore and Noah Hannafin fill out their lineup, here tonight it was once again basically like the Sharks were facing off against the Henderson Silver Knights. And yet, while you could say the Sharks didn't ice that great of a roster themselves, there are still a few NHL caliber players here, especially on the blue line, and the Sharks just got outworked completely throughout much of the night, leading to a third period where the Sharks, I don't believe, registered a single shot on goal for the first 15 or so minutes of it, and that includes a decent amount of the time where the Sharks were actually trailing by a goal. And so there was like score effects coming into play, and yet no shots getting onto the goaltender, finishing the night with just 14. So definitely a disappointing outing, even if at the end of the day, the result here in the preseason is something that will be forgettable in like a month's time. Now, in the first period, the Sharks were not playing particularly well, but luckily the Golden Knights did not manage to score any goals, and so it ended up 0-0. And in the second period, the Sharks actually got on the board first. This one came from one of the newest San Jose Sharks, Dmitry Orlov. That makes it 1-0. But then the game is tied up by Schwint, and we head into the third period tied at 1. And I already mentioned the Sharks heavily outshot in the third period, just didn't really show up to play all that much, and all the Golden Knights needed was a power play goal to make it 2-1. That ended up being the game winner, and that was the final score. Moving on to the players to talk about, because of course this is really what matters ultimately in these preseason games, we have the Sharks' top line of Musty Wenberg and Ethan Cardwell, which was definitely a pretty interesting inclusion here in this top six, because if you look at the other players, it all makes a ton of sense. Eklund is a top six player, while Wenberg is more of like a middle six kind of guy. He certainly doesn't look out of place in this position. And then you have Misa, Musty, and Chernyshov. Despite the fact that Misa or Musty and Chernyshov might not be NHLers this season, they do have that kind of ceiling and potential to be top six guys in the future. But Ethan Cardwell, if he is going to end up being an NHLer at some point in the future, or perhaps in the near future, it is likely going to be as a fourth liner. And so there's a question of why he found himself in this position. And while I don't know what the logic may have been from Morsovsky, I do see one very big reason for why this could end up being the case. And that is because if Cardwell is going to end up making the NHL team this season, it is hard to view him leapfrogging either Barclay Goodrow or Ty Dellandrea based on just defensive play alone. Despite the fact that both Goodrow and Dellandrea were two of the worst even-strength players in the entire NHL this past season, Cardwell is still a little bit of a question mark. While he plays rather well in the AHL, at the NHL level, it is a pretty significant jump. He only played a very small handful of games last year, where defensively he did look a little bit shaky at time, and this was still somewhat of a roller coaster of an outing for him in this particular preseason game as well. And then we also have to take into account the fact that while Goodrow and Dellandrea statistically really struggle defensively, we know that Ryan Warsofsky doesn't trust the statistics, at least in this particular sense, and he absolutely loves both of these players, at least Barclay Goodrow, Dellandrea to a bit of a lesser extent. And so if Cardwell is truly going to end up leapfrogging one of these two guys for a lineup spot this season, it is not going to be coming from his defensive outputs, but instead from his offensive outputs. if both Michael Misa and Colin Graf actually find themselves in the Sharks' top 9 to begin this season, it seems as though Adam Gaudette will end up being the odd man out and have to find himself on the Sharks' fourth line. But for a player who scored 19 goals this past season, you would like to try and surround him with talent that can support that offensive output at least a tiny bit. And Barclay Goodrow, we know, cannot do that, and Dellandrea and his 1 goal in 70 games last season also can't really do that. But if Cardwell can actually bring that type of energy and that offensive ability, that can actually be a pretty decent setup. And so him getting this chance in the Sharks' top 6 is a look at what he can do when given a good offensive tool set from players here who, again, aren't necessarily top 6 guys. Wennberg maybe a little bit more of a third liner, though can kind of crack it as a second liner. And Musty, as we know, is not quite an NHL player just yet. It was still a situation here where there were going to be chances, and Ethan Cardwell was all around the puck here tonight. As I mentioned, it was a bit of a roller coaster of a game. There were some defensive issues, in particular in the first period, moments where he was a little overzealous. He's kind of chasing players and maybe lost body position a little bit, lost some races to the puck. But I think he did really pull together a little bit as this game went on, and in particular offensively is really where Cardwell did shine, and that was the big deal for this position on this top line here. He probably himself had a good 3 high danger chances in this game. While he doesn't actually manage to get a goal, he definitely could have had one with a little bit more luck. Hit the post, very, very close call in one particular position. So all in all, Cardwell was definitely one of the more noticeable offensive players for the San Jose Sharks in this game, and that does bode rather well for a chance of getting onto the Sharks lineup to begin this next season. When it comes to his 2 line mates, we have Alex Wennberg, who is one of the very, very few players on the San Jose Sharks roster who actually just doesn't have much to prove here in this preseason. He joins a guy like Tyler Toffoli in that same type of description. No matter what happens in the preseason, even if he plays very well or if he plays very poorly, we're going to see Alex Wennberg either on a second line if Misa struggles a little bit and finds himself on the third, or on a third line if Misa is finding success and finds himself in the top 6. There's not really going to be any sort of variations to that. You don't see him getting bumped to the fourth line. You don't see him getting bumped to the first line unless there are major injuries that occur on this Sharks roster. And so you don't really need to see much from Wennberg in this game. Here tonight, you probably got like 75% of his actual like high-level performance, and that was still quite serviceable. He played an all-around pretty good game. Was he amazing? No. Was he great? Also no. But was he good? Was he good enough? Perhaps not for the grand totality of this game because the Sharks did end up losing, but all in all, he's not really the forward that you look at and say he needed to play significantly better because he played all right. And then finally, we have Quentin Musty, one of the very few players here tonight who was also in the first preseason game that the Sharks played. So this is quite clearly sending a message to this particular player that they want to see more from him. And that is, I would say, a positive message to be sent to Musty. And here tonight, I thought, again, he played a rather solid game. It wasn't incredibly loud, as was the case for the entire Sharks roster here tonight. I already mentioned they got pretty heavily outworked by Vegas, and so it's hard to point to a particular player and say they were absolutely outstanding, but I do think Musty was in the upper echelon of Sharks forwards here tonight. He had a couple of great chances. I thought he was actually relatively responsible defensively, which is very nice to see for a player like Musty, where that was one of his major weaknesses as a player coming into this season. So all in all, another good showing from Quentin Musty, even if, you're still kind of looking at him as more as an AHL guy for this upcoming year. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here we have Eklund with Misa and Chernyshov. We'll start off with William Eklund. Not quite in the same category as Alex Wennberg. I do still think there's more to get out of William Eklund as he kind of continues his upward trajectory and development as a player, coming into now his 3rd full season in the NHL. Also notably that this is an Olympic year, and that is something that Eklund definitely is going to be striving for, to get a spot onto that Swedish national team. So he's got a ton to play for. And while I don't necessarily think we got Eklund's best here in this game, the preseason affects us all, I do still think that just from a pure skill perspective, Eklund was likely the best player on the ice. From the San Jose Sharks, we saw a lot of very high moments from Eklund. I mentioned Cardwell getting a good 3 high danger chances himself. You could probably add Eklund's 3 or so high danger. In fact, these were like the only 2 players who got some really good looks. Maybe a couple of others did as well. But Eklund was playing very well throughout much of this game. Again, not his best, but looked quite good. When it comes to his two line mates, next we have Michael Misa. Very interesting outing, I would say, for Michael Misa, who continues to prove himself from a defensive standpoint, which is always kind of a surprise. You don't really expect an 18-year-old to have their shining attribute be their defensive play, and yet that is really what we have seen from Michael Misa over these last couple of games. The back-checking effort, the fact that he's coming below his own goal line to support his defense. He's even deeper in the defensive zone than the blue liners that the San Jose Sharks have at times. He really wants to be able to be the guy helping out. That's not something that you usually see. Usually you see guys cheating for offense a little bit. That's not Misa's game at all. And so defensively, he has been doing rather well. It should, of course, be noted that both of the games that we have seen, because Misa has played in both of them, have been against AHL caliber lineups here against this Vegas Golden Knights team. And it is a lot easier to defend, Cole Schwint than it is to defend Jack Eichel. So there is still much larger tests to come over the coming week and then couple of weeks as we move into the regular season, but it is certainly a good sign that we are seeing strong instincts defensively. I would still like to see more from him from an offensive perspective. You don't really draft a player at second overall just for their defensive game. You want to be able to see more of that offense come out, right? You look at a player like Alexander Barkov with the Florida Panthers. Yes, he piles up Selke trophies like pretty much nobody else, at least currently. Patrice Bergeron was the guy before that. But what really makes him one of the best centers in the NHL is the fact that he is able to combine that while also being able to be an 80 to 90 point guy. So you're still waiting for a bit more offense from Michael Misa. I think there were at times in this game where he got a little bit outmuscled. I think he does need to keep his stick on the ice a little bit more. There are times where the puck just kind of flies by him, even though he is in that general vicinity to be able to pick it up. But just the game moves quite fast at this level, even against a weaker Golden Knights squad here with the players that they iced, that I think it'll catch up for sure, and Misa certainly has great fundamentals already established. It's just about seeing that kind of next step be taken. And then when it comes to Chernyshov here, unlike Misa and Musty, Chernyshov did not play game one of the preseason, but he gets into action here tonight, finds himself on a pretty good line here with Eklund and Misa, but it did not remain that way throughout this entire game, and that was actually somewhat of a surprise. As we headed into the third period, Chernyshov was actually bumped to the fourth line. Delangere was bumped up to the second line. This lasted all of about 10 minutes. Then we saw, and I think Chernyshov maybe got 2 shifts on the fourth line, and then he was reunited up with Misa and Musty as a second line, where we saw them together for maybe 1 or 2 shifts. But it was kind of a strange demotion, because while I know Chernyshov played quite poorly back last weekend, or I guess now it's a couple of weekends ago at the rookie face-off tournament, I actually thought he started this game out decently well. Again, you didn't get much high-level plays, as you really didn't see a ton of that this game from the San Jose Sharks as a whole. I thought he did a lot of the little things rather well. He battled pretty well. He connected a couple of good passes, and so generally I thought Chernyshov was one of the better Sharks forwards in this game, but I guess maybe Warsofsky disagreed with me, at least briefly, to begin the third period. But still a solid start to the preseason for Chernyshov after that rough rookie faceoff outing. Then we get to the Sharks' third line. Here we have Gaudreau, Gaudette, and Delangere. Now, on the surface, this is a third line that I imagine the Sharks are putting together because they view it as a potential fourth line to begin the season, right? I mentioned that Gaudette likely will find himself on the fourth line if both Graf and Misa crack the top 9 of this roster, and he could easily be joined by both Gaudreau and Delangere. So this was a chance to see how these 3 players would do together, and against a weak competition here in Vegas, it was an absolute disaster. Now, don't get me wrong, both Gaudreau and Delangere I actually think came out with a good amount of energy. It was quite clear that both of these players were well aware of the fact that their spots on this NHL roster with the San Jose Sharks are kind of in jeopardy. I don't know how serious that actually is, especially from a Gaudreau perspective, but that it is not for sure a secure 100% sure thing that they will be on the Sharks roster to begin the year. So they definitely came out with some speed and they were throwing the body around, but just because you skate fast and you lay some hits doesn't mean you're actually playing all that well. And if you continue to just find yourself hemmed into your own zone as they did the entirety of last year, that's not really any sort of improvement. And just as I said, this was an easy opponent. That the opponents are not going to get any easier in the NHL here than this Golden Knights squad here tonight. And the fact that Gaudreau and Delangere, you could tell that maybe not 100%, but they were at 90% in this game, and they were still struggling as much as they were. It's it's not really all that great of a sign. And then you look at Ethan Cardwell on the top line, perhaps being like a top 3, top 2 forward for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. That is something that would kind of, if I was Dellandre or Goodrow in this situation, I'd be a little bit nervous that I might not have a Sharks roster spot to begin the year. When it comes to Adam Gaudette, I'm a little bit more lenient with him. This was his first game in teal, his first preseason game here with the Sharks, and so it's kind of a situation where you want to see a little bit more from him, but not exactly a great outing either. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Grundstrom with Bistedt and Carson Wetch. Not exactly a particularly notable fourth line, I would say. I don't think any of these players really made a huge impact on this game, besides Wetch kind of getting into it physically, as he usually does in the final few minutes of the third period. It just wasn't really remarkable from any of these three players, which is a little bit of disappointing, in particular from Philip Bistedt. I am hopeful, however, that as this preseason goes on, we can get a game from Bistedt a little bit higher up in the lineup. Maybe in the next preseason game or game 4, Bistedt could find himself on like a second line role and he could actually be given more offensive help, because obviously Wetch and Grundstrom aren't really the best of best players that you can have on your line. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, as I said, San Jose did ice a roster that you honestly wouldn't look completely out of place in the NHL in this particular season. Obviously it's missing a couple guys like Klingberg, who I believe was injured, or maybe even Nick Leddy or Desharnais, but these are 6 defensemen who definitely wouldn't look completely out of place in an NHL lineup, and it was pretty good at times for some of them. In particular, this top pairing of Mukhamadullin and Orlov, this could be the Sharks' top pairing going into this next season for them, and they looked really solid. Orlov in particular, not only does he manage to pick up this goal, he just looked rather steady. The big thing that surprised me about Orlov was actually that I didn't realize that he was kind of like a bit of an undersized defenseman. I thought just that he'd be like a 6'2", 6'3" type of player, and perhaps this looked kind of like even more so because you're playing next to Mukhamadullin, who's like a giant. But Orlov did look a little bit smaller out there. I believe he's like 5'11", 6 foot, but that clearly didn't get in the way of any issues here tonight. Orlov played rather well, was perhaps the Sharks' best defenseman in this game. And that certainly bodes well for them heading into this next season. As I mentioned, if the Sharks are actually going to see some significant improvements this year, Orlov, who has been brought in to likely be their number 1 defenseman, actually has to play rather well in that number 1 defenseman role. And obviously this was not a huge challenge for him, but it was a good first sign. And when it comes to his defensive partner Mukhamadullin, a lot of the sort of echoing similar things here. A pretty good night for him as well. That should pretty easily secure a spot not only in the Sharks' top 6, but probably top 4 heading into this next year. When it comes to the Sharks' second pairing here, we have Dickinson and Liljegren, the final player out of 3. It was Musty, Misa, and Dickinson, who have now played both preseason games this year for the San Jose Sharks. I actually thought Dickinson had a really solid night in this particular game. Not a ton of offense being generated. There was like 1 or 2 moments. He had like a strong give and go or attempted give and go with Quentin Musty at one point, which he ends up getting knocked down, so he wasn't able to get that good shot off. But there were some decent moments for Sam Dickinson from an offensive perspective. I also thought defensively he was usually rather solid. There was one play on like a penalty kill where he kind of overchased and got beat to the net, I believe, by like Alexander Holtz or something like that. So that was a little bit of an awkward play, but generally I thought Dickinson looked rather good. The issue I have, the small worry I have, is that what we have seen constantly from Sam Dickinson over both of these preseason games is just how aggressive he is from both an offensive and defensive perspective. He is very much willing to challenge players one-on-one, basically saying to them, like, you're not going to get past me. I'm going to force you to make a decision, force you to make a play. And in the OHL, he's able to easily get away with that and strip players of the puck or force them to make a bad choice. And he was able to do that in both of these first 2 preseason games as well. But as the competition gets much steeper, when you start facing off against, Mark Stone and Jack Eichel and Tomas Hertl, and not so much against the kind of AHL guys that the Golden Knights had here tonight, there will be moments where you go up aggressively to challenge and you get burned and it ends up in the back of your net. So Dickinson will have to get a little bit smarter when it comes to like when is the correct moment to make these types of plays, but I do appreciate the confidence that he is willing to go for them in the first place. That is something that you cannot necessarily teach. You have to come with as a player, and Dickinson clearly has it in spades. spades. When it comes to his defensive partner here tonight, we have Timothy Liljegren. Now, I don't think Liljegren had a terrible performance here tonight. The thing is that if we go back to my predicted defensive pairings for the San Jose Sharks from a couple of months ago, I didn't even have Timothy Liljegren in my starting top 6. I just couldn't really see the space for him. You have Mukhamadullin and Orlov, you have Klingberg and Ferraro, and then you have Dickinson as a 5th guy who will at least be playing like a good amount of games this season, and then your 6th, while maybe he doesn't fully deserve it, could end up being like Nick Leddy, and Liljegren could find himself on the outside looking in. Now, he does have an advantage of being a right-handed defenseman, but he still needs to be able to prove himself a little bit in this preseason, and while I don't think Liljegren was terrible here tonight, I don't think he was particularly good either, and he certainly didn't separate himself from the pack. And the thing is that 5 days ago, we saw Sam Dickinson paired with Vincent Desharnais, and that was the best defensive pairing for the San Jose Sharks in that particular game, and it's one that makes a ton of sense on paper. Dickinson, the more mobile offensive defenseman, with the more stay-at-home defensive defenseman that is Desharnais. A Dickinson-Liljegren pairing doesn't really make a ton of sense on paper at all, and so if this is something that the Sharks are looking at towards as like a third pair in the NHL, I'm not sure why Wersofsky would choose Liljegren over Desharnais unless he is playing significantly better, and we didn't get that here tonight. So just as Liljegren kind of lost his spot with the Toronto Maple Leafs at the beginning of last season, the same thing could be playing out this year with the Sharks. When it comes to then the third pairing for San Jose, we had Ferraro and Thompson. I actually wasn't that big of a fan of either of these two players here tonight. Now, you could sort of argue that Ferraro kind of does fall into the same category as a Wenberg or a Toffoli, where he doesn't really have a ton to prove here with the San Jose Sharks. Like, he's obviously going to be in the lineup. He's someone who the Sharks will use on the penalty killing role because he blocks shots and he lays hits and things of that nature. But with Orlov coming in and Klingberg coming in, Ferraro had previously been looked at as like a top pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, a guy who ate a ton of minutes, and that spot is somewhat in jeopardy, and I don't really think this performance here tonight really lets you kind of get excited about Ferraro heading into this next season. It feels as though a lot of those same mistakes were being made, where Ferraro is just kind of chipping pucks off the glass, no-look kind of attempted clears that are easily getting picked off because they're like 50-50 pucks up high along the boards. You see guys like Orlov and Mukhamadullin being significantly smarter with how they're able to clear out the puck, and then Ferraro just kind of doing these hope for the best type of moments, and it wasn't really working out that significantly here tonight. All in all, I don't think Ferraro was terrible, but I was kind of expecting a little bit more from this particular player, and the same for sure does go for Jack Thompson, actually very much echoing the points I made about Timothy Liljegren, but even worse in this case because Jack Thompson is viewed as more so as like the 9th defenseman on this team. At least Liljegren is maybe more like that 7th or 8th, but Thompson is a guy who's not only in jeopardy of missing an NHL lineup spot this season, but perhaps even in jeopardy of being sent down and having to pass through waivers. This could perhaps be one of the last games that we see from Jack Thompson in teal, so you were kind of hoping for some really great things from him, and I don't really think we actually got that in this game. Again, like with Ferraro, he was not terrible, but he certainly wasn't all that great at all, and it was a situation where against easier competition, the bar was kind of higher, and he didn't quite hit that. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender here, Yaroslav Askarov. So after we saw Nedeljkovic, the first part of the tandem play a few days ago against Vegas, we get the second part of that tandem here tonight with Askarov. Now, you could say Askarov kind of got out-competed in a way because obviously Nedeljkovic picked up the shutout in that first game, and Askarov lets in a couple of goals here. Could Askarov have potentially made a save? Well, I know Schwint, I think this puck was like maybe tipped in front, or at least there was a pretty significant screen, maybe a hit off of somebody. Won't put in too much blame on that. The Cormier one, I didn't get too many great replays on. Maybe it deflected, maybe it did not. Askarov, I will say, however, looked a little bit shaky in this game. Not so much so, but it felt as though he was kind of off angle a little bit at times. And I will also point out that when it comes to actually playing the puck, we can actually compare him to Nedeljkovic from back in that first game. Nedeljkovic looked a lot more in control and a lot more in sync with the Sharks roster. It felt as though he was more so acting as that third defenseman, while with Askarov, a lot of these were kind of some like adventures out of the net where, yeah, the Golden Knights didn't really know what he was going to do with the puck, but neither did the Sharks, it seemed. And there were a few moments where Askarov kind of surprised his teammates with where he ended up playing the puck. That was something we we saw a decent amount of near the end of this past season, and you were kind of hoping that would see some improvement this year. Obviously, this is just game 1 of the preseason for Askarov, but that is definitely something that needs to get better, because just one singular mistake in these types of moments can lead to a goal quite easily if your goaltender is outside of the net and below the goal line, and those are not types of mistakes that you can afford to make, especially if you are this San Jose Sharks team. So we'll see what ends up happening. I obviously have faith that Askarov will clean things up. He is a very, very talented goaltender. Well, we'll see how the rest of this preseason and heading into the regular season does go. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, I believe, in a couple of days with another preseason game. That will be game 3. We're getting to the halfway mark of the preseason. I don't know if we'll get like some major training camp cuts just yet. That might come after like game 3 or game 4. We'll see like, 15 players or something get sent back to juniors or the AHL or what have you. But we're definitely getting to the point where we're kind of cutting things down, trimming some of the fat on the edges, and really getting to the point where not only we have the NHL roster, but a few players that you want to get an increased and extended look at. So we'll see how it all plays out and the decisions that the Sharks end up making. Class dismissed.